Good evening, and welcome everyone to your Cannabis Equity Minutes with Cynthia Mompoint on this Friday evening of August 6th, 2021. We're going to jump into how we've been doing it consistently, which is looking at the data, seeing where we are, what the cannabis numbers are. Are we making any headway when it comes to equity in this industry? Because that's what they said that we were going to do when we opened up and legalized cannabis. This is the campaign, right? For so long, prohibition has done Black and brown people for so wrong. It's time that we open up the market so that we can be a part of this legal industry and no longer suffer the consequences of that. So here we are in August 2021. Have we moved the needle? On the national front, we're still looking at 18 states where adult use is legal. There's some form of legislation movement towards legalization, and we still have plenty of states in this country where it is illegal to participate with this plant, and it doesn't matter whether it's legal or illegal because at the federal level it's illegal. We are still being locked up at disproportionate rates, regardless of what the data, what state you're looking at, how you're cutting the data. Black and brown people continue to be arrested, and it's going to be the case unless we put an onus on our legislators, unless we put an onus on our community, our business partners, and our organizations to demand that what is being pushed forward is actually equitable in outcome, not just to say that there's an opportunity to pursue a license that the industry is opening up, but that they actually do something to address the direct harms. And so with that, let's go ahead and jump in. This time around, we're going to keep our time together quick, but we're still going to cover quite a bit. First up, with the data, Massachusetts. Consistently looking at Massachusetts for several reasons. Massachusetts is one of the few states that doesn't have a license cap overall in terms of the number of licenses that are being issued in this industry. Other markets have caps on their licenses. So for instance, you hear right now in Illinois where there's a lawsuit brewing right now because they've opened up the licenses. They had a set number, I think it was about 75 licenses that they were going to issue. Massachusetts, that's not the case. They are looking at applications from anywhere in the state on a rolling basis. And to date, we have 271 businesses that are operational in Massachusetts. Of those 271 businesses, how many of those are equity-owned businesses? How many of those are owned by either economic empowerment certificate holders? 5. Now, the last time we dropped this data point on Cannabis Equity Minutes was about 5 weeks ago. And that was the last time we dropped this data point, and it has not moved. We're still at 5. When it comes to social equity participants, the number of operational businesses that are owned majority by social equity participants, 5 again. So we're looking at a total of 10 licenses out of 271 in an industry and in a market that said that they were going to prioritize equitable participation. They were going to prioritize equity applicants in this industry. So much so it is written in our legislation. Now, when we look across the country, other states have not taken that measure, but you do hear a lot of conversation about equity and the importance of equity. You see businesses starting to develop their community outreach messaging, whether that be their platforms or even on their social media platforms or their websites, where they have a section devoted just to their social responsibility, their corporate social responsibility, their social equity programs. And when we talk about equity, we have to make sure that we do not let the very people who were responsible for prohibition. Now, perhaps it's not the individual, but let's be honest, collectively, all industries in our country are led by white men. So here we have equity, and we're talking about social equity, and we cannot sit here and rely on white men and even white women for that matter to be the leading voice in this space. And so here on Cannabis Equity Minutes, the goal is to empower you, one, to have some information that you can stand up and have a voice in this space, and two, a place where we're not going to continue and just follow along with what the status quo is, not if we want to see something different. All right. So when we're talking about equity, we're talking about social equity in the cannabis industry. The first thing is we need to make sure that everyone is clear. We're not talking about gender equity. This is not an issue about gender. We were not talking about women who were disproportionately targeted. Yes, women, particularly Black women, I'm being very specific, Black women were affected by the war on drugs. However, when you talk about Black people, that covers the genders, right? Men and women. So when we're talking about equity in this space, we're talking about Black and brown people. We're talking about the war on drugs and how it targeted Black and brown people, but then it created a stigma that not only affects how we interact with white people, how we interact with the plant, but even how we interact with each other, right? Because it created a level of white supremacy where we have people looking at Black folks in this space, looking at brown folks in this space in a different lens. Literally, we would talk about it, and we say, well, marijuana use, when we're talking about Black participation, Black and brown. And I'll say it again, if I say Black, if I say brown, if I say Black and brown, technically I am speaking specifically about the population that was targeted by the war on drugs. And at the time, the phrase that where we've evolved to using brown was not what was used, right? They said Black folks, it didn't matter what kind of Black you were, where you were on the spectrum. If you weren't white, basically, if you weren't part of the class of folks who came under the white umbrella, you were deemed Black. And there are certain brown populations who were not targets, particularly when we look at certain Asian populations. However, looking at you as it's skin deep, because that's what it is. It's a social construct, and so we're going to keep it there because that's what they use to destroy our communities, to destroy our families, to lock up our men, and to target even our children, right? It was how did we look? And then they tie that to where we were in our communities. So let's get into when we're talking about equity in these spaces, and it's a feel-good conversation, right? Social corporate responsibility. We're doing something good for the community, but what is that really? And what does that outcome translate to when it comes to our presence in this industry? I just went over the numbers here in Massachusetts, and our presence are abysmal. We're not even looking at 10% in this industry. What does it look like? What does equity look like when the outcomes and the impact that it has on our participation in this industry? Now, again, I stick on the point of equity as ownership when we're talking about equity, because that's really the crux of it, right? We have, because that's where the positions of power, we start to talk about positions of power. It doesn't automatically translate into that, and I'm going to get into that in a second, right? But positions of power in this industry. One thing that we saw a shift that we saw happen in Massachusetts was that our commissioners, we see now, we have 2 commissioners of color, which we did not see in the past. We did have an Indian American woman of color, but now we have a Black woman and a Latina woman who, I'm not quite sure how she identifies, if she identifies as brown, Black, or just a woman of color. But going back to what I said with the social construct, when you see her, when we talk about what happened with our law enforcement, when they see you, what do they see? They see a Black woman, right? And so that's what we see in positions of power at this point. And the goal and the hope and the anticipation is that as we see our presence, our participation, and our power increase in this industry, we're going to be able to make a difference when it comes to equitable participation. We're going to actually see the data move. We're going to see the needle move. Now, I said I was going to come back to ownership. one of the challenges that we are facing here in Massachusetts, it's a double-edged sword, right? Well, we're celebrating the exclusivity that they put together for equity participants to secure licenses in the delivery space. It's a double-edged sword because now the expectation is that, oh, well, Black and brown folks go get a delivery license. Well, one, not everyone wants a delivery license. Secondly, that doesn't answer the charge for having participation in other areas: cultivation, product manufacturing, retail. And what we see happening here in Massachusetts is there's almost like a chokehold that is being created. All of the 5 economic empowerment certificate holders are retail owners. So we don't even have economic empowerment certificate holders operating medical treatment centers or cultivation facilities or product manufacturing facilities. We don't see that level of diversity and participation. And the reason why this matters is because we want to see equitable participation because of the general wealth building opportunities. We're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry, which a year ago, they were talking about projections on a national front where by 2025, they said we'd reach $17 billion in revenues. That number has been hiked up to $41 billion. And I promise you, by the end of this year, if you stick with me with Cannabis Equity Minutes and the updates that I'm giving you, that number is going to be even greater. So $41 billion in annual revenues is what is expected to be generated in this industry. And yet we have folks talking about equity, and they're literally trying to pigeonhole us in one particular license model, if you will. And then in general, on a national front, in the space of equity, the conversation centers around expungements, completely negating the decimation that's happened to our communities, the trauma, the impact that it's had in terms of the stigma tied not to the plant at this point I'm talking about the stigma tied to Black and brown people because of the campaign with the war on drugs. Really, it criminalized our skin color. It not only put a target on it, but it also made it to the point that we're having these conversations now where in the workspace, we have to argue and say, oh no, no longer can we say for the same pay, for the same position, a Black or brown person has to work twice as hard, has to be twice as good. No, it's going to be whatever the standards are, that's the standards that we need to meet. And as a society, we need to come to head to this. And until we're doing that, which is going to come through the form of education, it's going to come through the form of purposeful legislation, just the way the campaign was purposeful. It's going to come through the form of us having these hard conversations. Until we're doing that, if we don't get to that point, it's going to be business as usual. It's going to be a status quo that's perpetuated, and the outcome is going to be far greater and detrimental for our children, because they're not going to understand how was it that we had a social equity program. We had equity at the forefront of our conversations, but then fast forward 5-10 years from now, 2025, even when this $40 billion industry is booming in our country, and we don't see our participation. And somehow we are still being arrested. Somehow children are still going to be dealing with the legacy of the legacy market, the legacy industry. They're still dealing with that because we're not getting at the root of it. We are literally scratching the surface and accepting when those currently at the forefront are telling us either to wait for the Banking Act, wait for legislation in Massachusetts to say, oh, okay, we have funds set aside, as opposed to taking action right now with the things that we can do, with the measures that are currently in place to maximize our participation in this industry, putting the onus on every stakeholder and their role in leveraging their position to promote participation. Is it going to be easy? No. Does it require a shift in thinking? Absolutely. Does it require a shifting in resources? Absolutely. Does it require a shift in power? Yes. And those last two things are probably the hardest part for those who are currently in positions of power, those who currently dominate the presence and participation in this industry, for them to grapple with and understand what we have to do. And so it's incumbent upon every one of us, those of us who recognize what it means to have equity in the space and what social equity can look like. And it's incumbent upon those who say that they want it to take the time and really think about, is it enough for us to celebrate expungement record parties? Is it enough for us to celebrate when we have one or two individuals opening up against 10, 11, 15, 17 other licenses opening up at the same time? Is that enough? And the short answer is no. And if it's not enough, then what do we do now? Our Cannabis Control Commission has been talking significantly more about the positive impact plans. And there's even conversations now being put out as to the availability of looking at the positive impact plans that have been reviewed and approved by the commission. But the charge is not just that. The charge is, how do we hold the existing businesses accountable to their contribution to equity in this space, to social equity, to addressing those who have been harmed the most by the war on drugs? How do we hold them accountable in relation to the revenue that they're able to generate in this market? I took some time and I was looking at some of the websites and some of the platforms and some of the information that some of the businesses have been putting out in terms of the work that they're doing around equity. And it's still at this superficial level in a lot of instances. We may have one or two examples where we can say, hey, these folks are actually doing something where we're going to see the needle move with participation, and if it's by one individual that they help assist getting into this industry, then so be it, or if it's by a larger group. But for the most part, we see a lot of donations to community organizations, which is important. But should that meet the requirement of the positive impact plan in our market when we have a mandate on the books? Absolutely not. We see conversations around mentoring programs and seminars and workshops. Now, the state already has that they're offering to the equity participants. So that's one, to realize that there is a disconnect in the communication, because some of these businesses don't even realize, hey, you're offering the folks that you say you want to reach, they already have access to that. Now, there are, and I'll take some time to dig in a little bit more into some of the specific examples of businesses here. There are some who are offering very specific training and diving in deeper into certain things like aquaponic grow and so forth. And so through the lens of looking at wanting to help someone who wants to open up a cultivation facility, or perhaps enter into this industry in a cultivation capacity at a more advanced position level, not just an entry position, then those types of opportunities, we need to see more of those, but that's not the norm. And it's not going to be the norm until those in positions of power start to do something about it. On the local front, I just want to highlight something that's really important for us to leverage. So I talked about the fact that we need all the stakeholders to maximize their positions in power. And then I again reiterated the fact that expungements of records are not what we need to focus on or elevate as the standard. That cannot be the baseline. We cannot say that we're going to accept that on a national front, on the local front, or on the state level front as a way to address the harms done by the war on drugs. That is one facet, but it cannot be our baseline. Our baseline, we have to have something greater than that. We have to have something that taps into the generational wealth building opportunity. Because remember, I said when the war on drugs, the campaign was so targeted and well orchestrated, it further stigmatized our communities. It doesn't matter which community you relate to now, white, black, brown, it doesn't matter. But it stigmatized this perception of black and brown workers, right? Because before then we had our communities, our completely black communities that were thriving. And then those communities were decimated. We had the Tulsa, Oklahoma riots, the massacre on Tulsa, Oklahoma. We had the Red Summers. We had even in Philadelphia, the bombing in Move. Like, we had all of these issues that they don't tell us about. They don't teach it to us in school. It's not something that you're going to see on the mainstream news, but yet they play a role as to where we are today and why we are sitting here saying that it's not enough to say that you are expunging records or you're even creating an opportunity and to deem that progress. That is not progress. Why? Because we started from a greater position. Not only were we set back intentionally, but then we were pushed back further. So now to come to the point of legalization with cannabis, because our country realizes the benefit with taxation and monetization of this industry and regulation of it. And to say that, oh, the opportunity is there and we're going to expunge records so that you can potentially get a job, that's not acceptable, right? And so bringing it at full circle, right, to where we are today and what we need to see happen, then the third piece is we need to get into the courts. And interestingly, earlier this week, there was a major case in Massachusetts coming out of the city of Salem, where there was a local Massachusetts business that was looking to open up one of their retail spaces in the city of Salem, and they weren't given a host community agreement. And, you know, for the grand scheme of things, there was a lot of conversation about whether or not the city had the right or the responsibility to give this business a host community agreement simply because that business met all of the standards or the requirements. They checked off all the boxes that the city had, or did the city have the opportunity to exercise discretion? Now, depending on how you look at this, you know, you can look at it from that lens, and then you can and see what the ruling was, which ruled in favor of the city of Salem. The city of Salem has the right to decide. That would be great if our cities and municipalities across the state, not just the cities, but the towns also, so all municipalities were actually prioritizing equity, because that would make sense then, right? It would make sense because now we would say, well, the municipalities really need to prioritize equity. So just because an applicant comes before them and they can check off all the boxes does not necessarily mean they get a host community agreement, because there is a mandate at the state level, which means it applies to everyone in the state, a mandate to promote equitable participation. But that wasn't the heart of the conversation in Medaille. And that's not the reason why I bring it up here, although it's a valid point. I brought it up because when you read descriptions of this case, they talk about the fact that this company literally threw every reason under the sun, every argument that they could possibly think at in the courts. They took it to the court. And then they appealed it. Then the Supreme Justice Court picked it up to argue why they should be given this license and the host community agreement so that they can pursue the license at the state level. And really, this company doesn't have much standing other than they're a company pursuing a business. And, you know, it doesn't matter what business, if it requires a license, there are certain things that need to be met, and certain licenses offer more discretion at the local level. Equity people, the economic empowerment certificate holders, we have legislative standing and we can't get our day in court. We have folks that would tell us, well, there's no standing, there's no grounds for you to argue that there was a wrong, an injustice enacted upon this class of people who hold this standing by our government, by those who wrote on our legislation. The Colorado Six, if you've heard us talk about that, the key actors who came into our industry and helped Massachusetts erect it and then turned around and benefited off of it, but did not ensure to it that equity participants, the economic empowerment certificate holders specifically, and subsequently the social equity program participants, right, that those with the legislative standing that we benefited from this. And to see that even a judge recognized that, and he can't, Judge Capper, when he gave his opinion and asked certain questions in this case of the business is called Madiri, so it's Madiri versus the city of Salem. When he was looking at this, he said, wait a minute, it would make sense that where's the economic empowerment certificate holders? I get why there's issues and concerns around the 3% tax, which is the max that communities can tax for on an impact fee. But yet we saw certain municipalities going in creative ways, circumventing that. And Judge Capper came out and flat out said, well, the commission should be doing more about this. They really have the authority to hold municipalities and businesses to the 3% tax, but more importantly, hold municipalities to the expectation that economic empowerment certificate holders are prioritized. And if you go back to when I put out the Massachusetts Marijuana Social Equity Report last year, I said that the state they do have things that they can do. If the argument was that they did not particularly have the funds at the time to support the businesses that were pursuing licenses through the economic empowerment program, they did have ways to really push and direct the industry to say, hey, we're going to prioritize economic empowerment certificate holders. We're going to make equity a priority, not just in writing, not just in rhetoric, but also in action and in outcome. And we didn't see that. We haven't seen that yet. And I think across the board, across the country, as we see legalization roll out, the court system is going to be an avenue that we need to look to, and those who are recognize themselves as allies in this movement for equity, for social equity, particularly to address the harms by the war on drugs, we each have to play our role in seeing how is it that we get to the point where if we take it to court directly, or we at least get it movement in court, and so that we can have action in the actual industry, movement in the industry through settlement, negotiation, action, regulatory decisions that will drive us towards promoting real equitable participation, real presence in this industry, real shift in power, so that it is more reflective of what it was when prohibition was fully in place. And what was that? We saw Black and brown people represented in our legal system because of their participation in this industry at 4 to 5 times the rate to their white counterparts. So we need to see that shift happen on the legal side as well. With that, I will wrap up this evening, but come back, tune in. We are going to be plowing through with these Cannabis Equity Minutes and really holding folks to the fire. We're not going to settle for the conversations that placate the status quo just to say that we talked about social equity, because there is a legacy that we are building and a foundation that we are establishing right now. And if we do not take a stand against it now, we will be looking back 10 years from now, 5 years from now, wondering how did we get here, and here being further away from an equitable industry. Thank you all. Tune in next Friday.